For America and the Middle Eastern countries by Anna Von Ritz. These intelligent agencies sits around and tell so many lies back and forth that none of them know the truth anymore. Literally, the CIA guys can't tell the truth at all. It's not in them. They open their mouths and cock screws come out. FBI, the only difference is the charming American accent, mainly because they are trying to copy their big brothers at the CIA and DARPA and DIA and M16. It's hell to find good role models these days. Our sons grow up confused and crooked. Our intelligence agencies are more like Hollywood script writers. DIA, I don't think they were very acquainted with the truth to begin with. So the truth is not even the question with them. They spew wads of thready, gluey string-like information that sticks to the bottom of your shoes and make you wrinkle your nose late at night 20 years later. And if your intelligence networks can't tell the difference between beans and buckwheat anymore, what then? It's a sad commentary on where guile has landed us, a manure pile of corporate federalism fraud and lies piled on top of lies like a maggot and rotten banana sandwich. Here's an example of the latest biggest lie passed around. The CIA let the Iranians invest in our mortgage market, and the Iranians are responsible for the subprime mortgage meltdown in 2008, all the foreclosures. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry when I heard that one. The actuality is that the perpetrators of the mortgage market crisis in MERS and the foreclosure mills are all homegrown in the U.S., not American. Not our United States. No, the other United States, run by the Pope and the Queen. What happened is this, and bear with me as I take a detour into something that only appears unrelated. Back in the 70s, the U.S. had the refinery capacity to mainline Middle Eastern crude oil to market. So the U.S. and the OPEC cut a deal to corner the world's energy markets. Big bucks and big coercive power for both. The Middle East supplied the crude. The U.S. supplied the refinery capacity. The petrodollar was born. The oil business has always been a haven for liars, dice, and Oklahoma guarantees. But when it comes to the petrodollar, it sank to a new low. Do you remember hearing constantly how the U.S. was energy dependent on other countries for oil? How we were always struggling against an oil deficit, living in fear of an OPEC oil embargo? Nobody told you that the U.S. was constantly among the top 3 oil exports in the world during the whole same time. Did they? The U.S. was shoveling oil and oil products of all kinds out the door as fast as the Iraqis and Iranians and Jordanians and everyone else could ship the crude oil. And all that talk about oil deficits. The U.S. was pushing OPEC to sell them more crude oil, cheaper, so they could maximize their profits on the refined oil products and byproducts like plastic that were the value-added products at the end of the line. My grandma would call it shameful, deceitful, poor-mouthing, making everyone else think that we were starved for oil, dangerously low reserve supplies. Oh my, we just have to ask for higher prices at the pump. And nobody told you that the U.S. was sitting on oil fields that make Iran's resource look small either. But that's true too. And I'm not even talking about fracking. Theirs have light, sweet crude less than a quarter mile down in quantities that stagger the imagination, sitting parked in the western states and just offshore. The American oil companies didn't need Middle Eastern oil ever. They just wanted to buy out the Middle Eastern oil supplies, kill the Middle East off as a long-term competitor,
the cannabis capital of the world,
as cheaply as possible. And then, OG, look at all this oil we just found.
Like you have in the marijuana
so take in the fact that all the beeswax you heard on the nightly news and probably believed about oil deficits and oil dependencies was just more horse hooey fed to you and used to justify charging you a $5 a gallon instead of 50 cents a gallon. Between the government and the news media and all the intelligence agencies combined, none of them could tell us what day of the week it was without lying 2 or 3 times. That's also another good reason to clean the cat box during the nightly news time shot. But let's get back to the latest big lie about Iran being the cause of the mortgage debacles. Both the Middle Eastern oil producers and the U.S. oil refiners made out like bandits for years and years, and the Saudis and the Jordans and Iraqis and the Egyptians and everyone over there was lapping it up and spending like drunken sailors on infraction and goods supplies, mainly by guess who? European and American corporations. And then when the first flush over and done, the new Middle Eastern investors created by this glut of money started looking for good places to invest their wealth. And here's where they really diabolical stuff kick in. Did you know that mortgage-backed securities became available just as the Saudis and everyone else over the Middle East began earnestly looking for investment opportunities for the share of their oil money? It was like magic. Men in turbans started showing up, looking for good, stable, long-term investments, and poof, mortgage-backed securities appeared out of thin air. Brand new, wow, modeled on a money market approach to reduce risk long-term investing for the future. Blah, blah, blah. And this happened just coincidentally about the same time that the Bank of America and Merrill Lynch were getting nervous because they knew that virtually the entire mortgage industry in America was based on bank fraud and false claims in commerce. Now you might think that knowing what they knew about the fraudulent mortgage industry, they pulled the brakes on mortgage-backed security investments. But no, they decided instead to share the pain with the whole world and exploited it instead. They took a simple but profitable 1930s-style bank fraud and made it into a modern investment securities fraud. So there's the CIA, Bank of America offloading toxic investments based on bogus mortgages that they already knew were fraudulent because they set it up to con and hooked people who didn't really owe mortgages into paying them in the first place. Enter good old spread the liability Merrill Lynch, licking his lips, and J.P. Morgan Stanley. Oh, what a wonderful idea. Mortgage-backed securities. And they sold this concept to oil-rich Middle Eastern investors, both individuals and entire countries, encouraging them to invest heavily in this new sure thing, mortgage-backed securities. And they did this with malice, afterthought, full and well knowing that those mortgages were 90% phony, baloney, and that the sooner or later the fraud would be discovered and the whole market would tank. But you see, from their perspective, that wasn't a bad result. All the Middle Eastern wealth that could otherwise compete with and be a threat to them would disappear when the fraud at the core of the mortgage industry came out and the bubble burst. And when it did, they'll be standing more innocent as daisies in May, with their own share of the oil wealth intact, ready to buy back everything in sight for pennies on a dollar, just like they bought up everything in the 1930s for almost nothing. Now, if you were a Middle Eastern country whose oil supplies were petering out and you had socked most of your seed money into American and European mortgage-backed securities, and you found out that, in fact, over 1 billion people and companies had been grossly defrauded and were literally paying on mortgages that were never owed, and that, furthermore, the security brokers and banks had sold off and sold on shares in the same mortgage-backed securities you thought you owned, with no actual paper trail of validated proof of ownership interest using MERS, M-E-R-S, and had created a situation deliberately where dozens, if not hundreds of different investors had purported ownership interest in the same houses. Well, how would you feel about this? Probably the same way you feel when you wake up and realize that in all likelihood, you've been paying a mortgage you don't owe, just like your parents paid mortgages they didn't owe either. Probably the same way you might feel when you realize that your pensions fund got suckered in just like those over in the Middle East. And everyone be pointing fingers at everyone else. The victims in the Middle East will be pointing at the Americans, and the Americans will be told, or already being told, that it was the Iranians that did all this. And so, if we are really, really stupid, we will believe the nightly news again. But the fact of the matter is that this whole problem started back in the 1930s when FDR, Delano Roosevelt, led this country off the tracks and departed from a normal course of business without telling the rest of us. And the U.S. government, which is a subcontractor and not American at all, started letting the central banks bilk innocent Americans for fun and profit. You see, the Americans are victims on this mortgage side, and the Middle Eastern investors and our own pension funds are victims too. And there is only one common denominator: the middleman. The federal government subcontractors work for the Pope, and the bank and security brokers who are also working for the Pope. All roads lead to Rome and Mystery Babylon. If we have anything over the past 5,000 years, let us remember now that the vermin always blame the victims. And the vermins are kept so confused, they can't blame the vermin in return. Let's change that. See through that. The vermin will tell us that it's the evil Middle Eastern investors waging economic war against us. And they will tell the bilked Middle Eastern investors that it was the vile, sneaking Americans, never the U.S., the ones that actually did the dirt on both sides of the equation. And they will have us at each other's throat instead of going after the middleman responsible. Well, folks, this is a profitable pot of snakes for sure. Hardly anyone in America ever legitimately owned a mortgage. Maybe 12% of mortgages were valid, and even those can no longer be validated. People from all over the world, including our own pension funds, have invested in these worthless, fraudulent contracts. And the bank and security firms knew that they were fraudulent, worthless contracts when they sold them as investment. Now I am trying to be as honest and fair about this as I can be to everyone involved. I have my greatest sympathy for the victims on both sides, the Americans who were into paying debts they never owed, and the Middle Eastern investors who thought, like almost everyone else, that they were investing their oil wealth into rock-solid investments for the future. The ones I don't have much sympathy for are the bankers and brokers that have been engaged in bilking the American people since the 1930s, and the government that has promoted and allowed all this. I want everyone to understand that the U.S. government responsible for this is under contract to provide us with essential government services, but is in fact American. It's owned and operated by the Pope, both directly in the case of the municipal United States government, and directly because the Queen is his overseer of the British territorial United States government. So all you mad as hell Iranians, Jordanians, Iraqi, Kuwaits, Egyptians, everyone in the Middle East, we hear you. We understand why you are angry. But it isn't us doing this. In fact, we've been taking it in the shorts ourselves, and at the hands of the same perpetrators. Please stop shouting death to America and death to Americans. We've been fed lies for generations and used as mercenaries without even knowing that we acting as mercenaries. We aren't the problem. The problem is with our subcontractors, and they are all owned and operated by the Pope. So let's give him a hard time instead. We are doing our best to control of the situation, and it will be a good thing for everyone to simmer down and not let these racks succeed in getting us all to go to war, because that is what they want. They want to sit in the middle as the odd man out and let their victims destroy each other just by telling lies first to one and then to the other. Instead, we should concentrate on exposing the criminality to the entire world. We should confiscate their wealth and work with other people in other countries to clean this mess up. And we can do so without firing a single shot. 702 Vegas.